let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to Unit 8, and we will proceed from there. A quick review of last week, Unit 7. And again, we started talking about costs. We used an example of a bakery as one of our first examples, and we found out that there were some costs that were fixed. We had those expenses and we had to pay them whether we produced anything or not. Okay? Then we had some expenses we called variable expenses, and those expenses only changed anytime we changed the amount that we produced. Okay? And so they were directly connected to whatever it was we were producing, and so being connected, if we produced more of that item, we would have more expenses. So think of it like the ingredients in our pies. Okay? So we looked at or defined some costs. We defined average fixed cost because you're taking that fixed cost, whatever it was that you got to pay whether you produce anything or not, and you're spreading that over however many units you produce. As you produce more and more and more of that thing, each one will bear a smaller and smaller proportion of that fixed cost. Just like the $1,000 in the example, if we only made one pie, we'd have to have $1,000 on that pie in order to cover the fixed cost. If we make 1,000 pies, now each pie only needs to produce $1 or contribute $1 toward that fixed cost. So then we looked at variable costs, and we defined some numbers for our pie example, our pie bakery example. But then we went a step further, and we said, wait a minute, there are other kinds of production where we have what amounts to increasing variable costs. In other words, the variable cost for one unit, for a particular unit, may be more expensive than the variable cost for the unit before it. And we said one of the reasons for that, or the main reason for it, is what we refer to as diminishing returns to labor. Because normally labor is our most expensive part of our raw material, or of what goes into making whatever it is we're making. So if we have ever more increasingly expensive variable cost, then it's not necessarily like our pie example where each pie had the exact same amount of ingredients and labor. Okay. So then we started looking at how we compute average costs. And for average total cost, it was quite simply dividing the total cost, whatever they were, by however many we were producing. So that was a very straightforward calculation. Then we looked at average fixed costs, and we take whatever that fixed cost was, whether we produce anything or not, think of it as the rent on the building, and we divide it by however many we're producing. And that would give us how much of that fixed cost that each unit would have to share at that production level, okay? Or what we call average fixed cost. Then we saw that average variable cost was whatever the variable cost was, whatever the variable cost for that number of units was, divided by that number of units. And that gives us our average variable cost. Okay? Then we looked at a strange animal called marginal cost. Now, marginal cost is a special number that we need. But what's different about marginal cost is we take the total cost of the unit that we're looking at and subtract from it the total cost of one less unit. And that gives us the marginal cost for that one unit. Okay? So we'll be talking much more about the cost tonight because we're going to continue that whole analysis of these 6 or 7 cost items and then talk about how we relate them to what kind of price that we have. So we're going to do what's called cost analysis, but we're going to remain with a perfectly competitive market. Remember our assumptions for a perfectly competitive market, and that is that we have many buyers of the product and many sellers of the product. The product is identical. Okay? And no one buyer buys so much that they can control the price, and no one seller sells so much that they can control the price. So the price for the individual business is a given. It is the price set by the supply and demand in that perfectly competitive market, and so it becomes the equilibrium price. Okay? So then the question is, if we know what the price is, and we know what our costs are totally different than our price, then it's a simple matter to decide, A, should we produce, and if so, how much? And so that's where we're going to go tonight. Okay? To start off, I'm going to use an example of a kit building company, a company that makes kit airplanes. Now, what kit airplanes are basically all the parts you would take to build your own airplane. You buy the kit, and then you get all the parts at home, and then you build the plane yourself. Now, that's if you're somewhat handy. Okay? If you're not, you don't want to be doing that. You want to buy a ready-made plane that's made by a company that specializes in making a particular kind of plane. But that's beside the point. We're just going to use this as an example, and I will confess that the numbers I'm going to use in this example are made up, but they're there to illustrate what I'm after, the concepts that we're trying to explain. We're going to look at the calculations of the numbers, and then we're going to look at the curves, and then we're going to discuss them. Okay? So, starting off, I've given you a column of total costs, and then remember, we want to figure out what the variable cost is, so that's the column we're going to deal with. Okay? And I give you the definition of the variable cost so that you can see what the computation is. And I'll get something here I can doodle with. So we're going to start off, let's say we're going to measure 2 units. Okay, we want to know what the variable cost of 2 units is. Well, we can take that total cost and subtract from it the total cost of 0 units, or the fixed cost. Okay? And that'll give us our answer. And so we see the computation up here at the top. Very straightforward. Okay? And all we would do is repeat that process for the rest of the numbers in the column so that we could complete our column like such. Okay? Now, once again, in this example, we're selling individual kits of airplanes. So we sell one, or we sell a second one, or we sell a third one, all the way up to 9 in this example. Okay? Now, if you were to have a problem, well, we'll get to that in a minute. Hang on to that thought. Okay, so just realize that's what we're doing. Okay, another number we want to compute. Once we know what our variable cost is, we want to compute what our average variable cost is. Well, average variable cost, we're going to take what we found for our variable cost, and we're going to divide it by however many units we're producing to get our answer. And so we see it up here. We divide our variable cost of 60,000 by the 2, and we get our answer. Okay? If we repeat that process for the rest of the numbers in the column, we can complete that column. Okay? Now we have our spreadsheet where we have our average variable cost. We can go a little further and plot that curve. So this is what the average variable cost, and again I define it over here, and I made it in purple. And so each one of those values that you saw in the table are now plotted based on number of units. Okay? And so that's what our cost curve is going to look like. Okay? So let me try one other thing, see if this helps. See if that does anything for your sound. Okay, continuing, go a little bit further, and this time we're going to compute our average total cost. And our average total cost, get back to where I can doodle again. Okay, so our average total cost, well, we're going to take that total cost number and divide it by however many units we're producing. So we take our total cost, divide it by however many units. That gives us our answer, which goes in the column like such. And then again, it's a simple matter to go back and compute the entire column. So now we have average total cost. Okay? And we see the curve for average total cost starts off really high up in here. And again, if you remember our pie example, if we only produced one pie, it would have to bear all of the fixed cost. Well, the same thing's true here. If you produce one airplane, it has to bear all of the fixed cost plus its variable cost, so it's going to be a fairly high number. Okay? Now, as we produce more and more and more units, airplanes, we spread that fixed cost over more and more units. Okay? More and more airplanes in this case. But at some point, we start to get increasing variable costs that far outweigh the impact of spreading that fixed cost over more and more units. Okay? So that's when our curve, our average total cost curve, starts to curl upward. Okay? So we end up with a point that is our lowest average total cost at the very bottom of the curve. Okay. Continuing on. Now, we have one more column here we need to compute, and that is our average fixed cost. Remember, the fixed cost is how much it takes us, how much expense we have when we don't produce anything. And then we divide that number by how many we're producing. Okay? So in that case, we're going to divide our fixed cost by how many we produce to get our answer. Okay? And computing the entire column the same way, we're just dividing a different number into the fixed cost. So if we were to take 7, divide it into the fixed cost, then our average fixed cost when we produce 7 units would be $25,000. Okay? And so we can, compute all those numbers, fill them in, and we've got one more thing we want to look at, and that's marginal cost. Remember, I said marginal cost is a different animal, because what we're doing is we're taking the total cost of the unit that we're measuring and subtracting from it the total cost of one less unit. Okay? And that gives us our answer if we are counting by ones, if you will. Okay? So that's our marginal cost, and again, it's the change in total cost caused by adding one more unit. Okay. And once again, we can fill in the rest of the column, and then we can show the plot for the marginal cost. Now, one of the reasons that you'll see marginal cost are so important, if it is the additional cost of that next unit. Okay, that's the difference in total cost caused by producing that next unit. So it is the difference in cost of that next unit. Okay. Moving on, we'll get rid of this. So we have the main costs that we need to produce, and we have looked at their individual curves. Now we're going to put all the curves together. Okay? Now, remember I said the company is a price taker. That means that it is stuck with whatever price, the equilibrium price that is set by market forces in supply and demand. Okay? So this is just one small producer in a big industry where there are many, many, many producers. Okay? So this producer doesn't produce so many units that they can control the price. Okay? So we move forward, and let me stop. We have a question. We want to know, what is our minimum cost output level? And what this really means is, at what level, if we produce at that level, will we have the least amount of cost and therefore be the most efficient? If we produce fewer units, we'll have a higher cost. If we produce more units, we'll have a higher cost. So that minimum cost output level is an important number. We want to know where that is. That's going to be our maximum efficiency level. And what we do to compute that, and you may remember this from the previous unit, okay, basically we go to the average total cost and we look for the lowest number. What is the lowest amount of average total cost? And then however many units that is, that's what we're producing. Continuing on, we can go back to our chart of numbers and identify that lowest value. We see by going down the average total cost column till we find the smallest number. So we have 59,000, and then we end up with 55,800 and some, and then the next number is 56,000. It's bigger, and then it goes up from there. So this becomes our smallest amount, our lowest average total cost. And we see that occurs when we're producing 6 units. Okay. So if we look at it on the curve, okay, let's see if I have it. See if my next slide has it. No, okay. We'll come back here. So actually I went one slide too many, didn't I? Let's go backwards 2 slides. Okay, there's our slide. So here's our lowest average total cost, and we're getting it at 6 units. So that's how we determine that. So you've seen it in the graph and you've seen it in the chart. Okay. So we see it in the chart. Now what's important about that is it tells us where we're the most efficient. Okay. Now we haven't talked anything about revenue or price yet. We've only looked at our costs. So let's go a step further and say, let's assign a price. Let's say that the equilibrium price in this particular market was set at $80,000. Then the question becomes, where do we want to produce? Well, what we're really looking for is to produce at a point where our marginal revenue is equal to our marginal cost. But we haven't talked about marginal revenue, have we? Well, let's talk about marginal revenue for a minute. What marginal revenue is the additional revenue that one more unit will bring you. If we go back to our pie example, and let's say that we were producing 50 pies and we're selling them for $10 a piece. Okay? If we produce 51 pies, the additional revenue we get from that 51st pie is going to be $10 more. We'd actually have a total revenue of $510 if that were the case. Okay? And when we had 50 pies, we had a marginal revenue we had a total revenue of $500. So if we subtract the 500 from the 510, lo and behold, we find out that our marginal revenue is exactly equal to our price in a perfectly competitive market. Okay? So here we have a perfectly competitive market for these kit airplanes, and we find that our price of $80,000 is our marginal revenue. It is how much revenue, additional revenue, we're going to make off the next unit we sell. Now all we have to do is go compare it to our costs. And what we'll find, we're going to look for the point where that price line, or marginal revenue line, but we'll call it price for now, crosses our marginal cost curve. Remember, we computed marginal cost and we plotted it in the red curve. So we see that our $80,000 point occurs when we produce 8 units. So here's our 80,000 in our marginal cost, okay, at 8 units, and that's exactly where our marginal cost is equal to the price that we're able to get. Because remember, cost has no connection to price. Price we're stuck with, costs are what we try to control. Okay. Now, going a step further, okay, if we get that price, how much is it costing us to produce? Okay. Well, now we want to compare that marginal revenue and marginal cost, that price that we get, if you will, with what our average total cost is for that number of units. Okay. And we see our blue curve is our average total cost, and we find at that number of units our average total cost is actually 59,000 something. Okay, so we end up with a section here between the cost that it takes us, what our average cost is for that number of units, and what the price we're getting for that number of units is. And we can define that, okay, as economic profit. It is that green shaded area, and it is the difference between the average total cost for that number of units versus the price we're getting for that number of units. And we selected that number of units based on where our marginal revenue, the price, equaled our marginal cost, where those two were the same. Okay? So that's how we chose what the number of units was. Now, anytime we get a price above whatever our average total cost is, anything above there is going to exceed all of our costs, because all of our costs are built into that average total cost. So that means we're covering our rent, we're covering the ingredients, we're covering everything, and we have money left over. Now, realize this, that for any business, for people to be willing to invest in that business, they must make a fair rate of return given the risk that that business has, given the risk that they might lose all their money. Okay? So if we're going to have a business and we're going to have shareholders or investors in that business, or it's our own private business, we're going to invest our savings and work in that business, we're only going to do it as long as we can make a living at it, make enough money to survive and have a living. Okay? So there is some minimum amount of profit returned to the owners, or return on investment, that we need to make off any business in order to justify having the business exist. Now, when we're computing our average total costs in an economic sense, the way we're doing it here, we include a fair return to investors, a fair return on investment. Think of it as a fair profit rate. Okay? So when we computed this average total cost, it included that fair return to the investors. Okay? Now, any price we can get above that average total cost is going to give us what we call economic profit. That is profit above and beyond the normal profit that would be required to keep an investor invested in the business. Okay? So that's why we call it economic profit. Others might call it excessive profit, but in a perfectly competitive market, we don't think of it that way. We just call it economic profit. So I wanted to kind of get that concept out. Like I said, it's a relatively important concept to understand. But this is different from an accounting computation. If you were to ask an accountant what their average total costs were, they would have nothing built in for profit. But we know that in order to have a business sustain itself, that there must be a minimum level of profit generated from that business. And so therefore that minimum level of profit, in order to keep investors involved, is part of the cost of doing business. If you don't generate that much revenue, or that much excess revenue, you're not going to stay in business. So that's why we build it into our average total cost here. Okay. So we now know what an economic profit is, and we know that any time we are able to get a price higher than our average total cost for that number of units, we're making an economic profit. Now in your assignment for Unit 8, it's going to ask you, is the scenario, the business we're talking about, is it making a profit? Okay. Well, think economic profit. That's what it really means. Okay. Even though they didn't use the words. Okay. So what happens if the price falls a little lower? Okay. Here the price has dropped now from $80,000 down to $60,000. Well, if we take a look, we have our average total, or I'm sorry, our marginal cost over here. So that's going to be, and we find that our lowest average total cost occurs right here. Okay. Now, as long as we can get a price higher than our lowest average total cost, then we want to stay in, well, let's rephrase that. Okay, let me go back. We're going to take a look at this average total cost, and we're going to define that as our break-even point. What that means is if we can get that amount of money, whatever that we look at the cost, and if we can get a price equal to that cost, then we are covering all of our costs, including a fair return to profit, or fair return to the investors. There won't be any excess profit or economic profit, but we will have covered all of our costs, and we will have repaid our investors their return on investment. So this becomes our break-even price. We find it by looking at the lowest average total cost. Okay? We can find it on the graph, or we can also find it in the chart by just going down the column again, and lo and behold, wasn't that our minimum cost output level? Yeah, it was. Okay. So we know if we can function at that level, we're going to produce, if we can get at least that price, okay, then we're going to produce 6 units. Okay. We're going to cover all of our costs, including a fair return to our investors, but we won't make an economic profit. Okay. Okay. What happens if the price falls a little lower? Now, down in this area, now we've dropped from 80 to 60, and then from 60 to 40. Okay. Well, once again, in order to figure out how much we would produce, we see where the price equals our marginal cost. So we go down the red column until we get to the point where the marginal cost equals whatever that price is. So that's going to be the number of units we're going to produce. But wait a minute, we're not covering all of our costs because we're well below our average total cost for that number of units. So we're losing money. We're not covering all of our costs. Okay. Let's see if I can back up a little bit. Okay. But what's interesting is if we look at our variable cost down here for that number of units, we're at least covering our variable cost. Think of it this way. Okay. When we were making our pies, okay, ideally we would sell 1,000 pies. We would have $1 of fixed cost, and we'd have $4 of variable costs. And we did those computations, a couple units ago. Okay, when we got there, we could sell the pies for $10 a piece. Then we're making good money. Okay. However, if the price fell because we were price takers, we could get the price all the way down to $5, and we would still cover all of our costs. But if it dropped down to $4, we would cover the cost of the ingredients, but we would not make a contribution to the overhead. Well, we already paid for the overhead, the fixed cost. We already paid the rent for this month. So if the price did fall down, as long as we were covering all of our ingredients prices, then at least anything above that price, say we were getting $4.50 for our pies, then that would be 50-cent contribution per pie toward our fixed cost or toward our rent. Well, this is the same situation. Okay? So as long as our price is above our variable cost for that number of units, then whatever this difference is in here is at least a contribution to our overhead, or our what we would call our fixed cost. So we're not covering all of our fixed cost, but we're at least making a contribution to them. Now, once again, my objective in these explanations is to give you a preview of what's in the book, hopefully explain it a little bit more clearly, but at least get you to the point that as you're doing your reading, that your ears perk up and pay a little more attention when you get to these concepts, so that you're able to do sufficiently well in the assignment to get a good grade in this course. That's the objective. Okay, so we see that we would be losing money in this red area, okay, because it was this price is below our average total cost, but we're at least making some kind of a contribution to that overhead, to those fixed costs, because we're getting a price that is above basically what our average variable costs are for that number of units. So that's why understanding these costs are so important, especially if after you graduate and you're out in the working world and you get assigned to, you get promoted to a particular job, and now you're responsible for determining how much to produce. Well, you need to know how to go about figuring that out, and that's what this is all about. Okay, so we understand that we might be losing money, but as long as we're making a contribution to our overhead, then in a short run period of time, it's okay to continue to produce. Okay, going on a little further. Okay, what happens if our price drops even lower? So we started at 80, we went down to 60, then we went to 40, and now we're all the way down to 20. Okay, well, what we see is here, if we look at our average variable cost, our lowest average variable cost is at $20,000. Okay, that would be equal to the price. And what that's saying is that any price below that point, below whatever that cost is going to be so low that we will not have enough money coming in to cover the cost of the ingredients, or in the case of the airplanes, the raw materials and labor. Okay? If we were using our pie example, we would not have enough money coming in to pay for the eggs and the flour and the milk. So why would we make pies at that point? Or in this case, why would we make airplanes if the price drops lower than our lowest average variable cost? So we give that lowest average variable cost a name. We call it our shutdown price, because even in the short run, it does not make sense to produce when your variable cost, think of your ingredients, cost more than what the price is you're going to get for them. So it just does not make sense to continue a day longer in business under those conditions. Now again, realize we're talking about a perfectly competitive market where the business is a price taker in the grand scheme of things. So they're stuck with whatever price they are given. So what is that lowest average variable cost? Well, if we have a chart of numbers like we will have in your assignment, all you have to do is go down the average variable cost column, find the smallest number, and that is your shutdown price. If the price drops below that cost, you'll want to stop producing. Matter of fact, you'll have a question about that in your assignment. It says, what is the shutdown price? Now, you might remember that we had supply curve back in the beginning of the course, back in Unit 3 when we talked about supply and demand. And I tried to tell you that that supply curve was created based on the costs of all the different producers in that business. Well, we could take a look at this company and see what its supply curve would look like. Unfortunately, it's not as nice neat curve like my examples were earlier in the course, but we take these numbers. Okay, these are if we start off with the average total costs over here, and then once we get to the lowest average total cost, we would still produce somewhat based on our average variable cost until we get down to our shutdown price. So we can use those prices and quantities to figure out what our supply curve would look like. Okay, wrong button. There we go. And so if we were to plot it out, we'd have a supply schedule that looks like so, with how many we'd produce if the price were at these levels. Okay? And so when we produce that supply curve, and again, it doesn't have that nice straight line look like we had in the examples that I used earlier in the course, where the supply curve looks something like this. Okay, it didn't look quite that neat. It's got more kinks in it because we're using real numbers. But you get the idea. That's how that curve was created. It's a combination of all of the businesses in this particular market with each of the prices at which they're willing to produce at. Okay? And so that's how we ended up with when the prices were really high, we had a lot of producers, and when the prices were really low, we had very few producers. Okay. I'm sure you'll have some questions as you're working through this assignment. Make sure that you get in touch with me when you do. Now, what do you have to do this week? Well, we only have one chapter, chapter 12, and you'll notice there's a lot of similarity in this assignment and in the cost, just like we had last week. So in your assignment, you're going to have more computing of the costs, because remember, Unit 8 is a combination of Unit 7 and Unit 8, so they're combined. You'll have a discussion thread that's going to look like costs, but it asks you, if you were to start a business of your own, what kind of costs are you going to have to deal with? So it gives you a chance to kind of exercise your brain a little bit, especially if you've ever brainstormed the possibility of having a business of your own. If not, you can always use our pie example and discuss cost related to the pie baking company. Now, your assignment for this week has you computing minimum cost output level again, and this time you're going to have to also compute a break-even price and a shutdown price, and then you're going to be given a series of situations. Basically, here's the price, how much will the business make a profit, and should they continue to produce in the short run? Okay? Well, remember, they'll make a profit, and in this case we're talking about an economic profit, anytime their cost is above their lowest average total cost, they'll be making a profit. They will continue to produce anytime their price is above their shutdown price. Okay? And you know how to contact me. So nothing new there. I will be in this week's discussion thread, and I will